All right, we're back. Our republic is under dire exigent threat. Exigent means emergency. Emergency. Why is it an emergency? Because we are collapsing under a totalitarianistic fascism that is being implemented by this administration. The walls are being built around you as you speak. This isn't something that's happening slowly. It's moving at an incredibly freight train pace. I'm going to give you some short cover pieces on exactly what some of that looks like. ENDA. Have you ever even heard of ENDA? I don't even know what ENDA is, say most Americans. In fact, 99.5% of Americans have never even heard the word ENDA. It's the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And it's being called one of the most dangerous and discriminatory pieces of legislation in modern times. It's already passed the Senate, with a vote of 64 to 32, almost directly down party lines. 10 Republicans joined. They're traitors, yes. ENDA is also said to ultimately outlaw the Judeo-Christian sexual concepts and ethics. Here's what ENDA says. Well, first of all, the supporters say that it will insulate those who choose to engage in same-sex conduct. It supposedly will also protect those who are said to suffer from gender identity crisis against employment intolerance. The truth of the matter is, it will codify the very thing that purports to combat workplace discrimination. Gay activists want to eliminate religious exemptions and force violation of their faith and the acceptance of the LGBT community. And they're admitting it. The article here is from theexaminer.com, and the title of this article is "The Truth Comes Out," that gays admit ENDA is a ploy to outlaw Christian morality. WorldNet Daily just put an article out about this as well. Michelangelo Signorilli wrote in an article at the Huffington Post, he says, ENDA's religious exemption is clearly from the Stone Age and isn't something we should settle for anymore. What that means is, is that Signorilli is against any religious exemptions. None. So even if you are the Catholic Church, you must hire LGBT. Makes no difference. WorldNet Daily says that if LGBT activists get their way, Christians would be forced under penalty of law to abandon their viewpoints on biblical and traditional values on human sexuality. Now look, this would force churches, mosques, synagogues, religious schools, Bible bookstores, any kind of an entity that does business in America with 15 or more employees to hire and otherwise not serve to offend in any way, shape, or form those who openly flaunt their sexual preferences and their self-destructive sexual behavior. Now, look, I don't even want to get into this from a religious perspective. I don't even care. All I'm telling you is this. This is political correctness run amok for a very significant minority of the American population. I don't care who you sleep with. I don't care what you do in your own bed. I don't care who you love. I don't care who you don't love. All I know is that anytime you want to subject us, me, anybody else to your beliefs, you're wrong. Period. End of argument. End of discussion. Everyone has an opportunity, and if you have built a corporation and a business and a company, and you've put your blood, sweat, and tears and life and equity and savings and your own time, and you've sacrificed everything to build that, no one has a right to tell you that you must hire someone else who may be destructive to that business. Period. No caveat, no disclaimer, period. No one is entitled to the fruit of your labor. No one is entitled to anything. This concept that everyone is entitled to everyone else's everything is the old adage like, what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. And frankly, I've had it. And so would most of America if they even knew that this was existing. That's that topic. I'm going to touch, listen, there are so many of them. The Associated Press has an article out about how the dirty, secret cost of Obama's green power push. Ethanol is destroying our environment. They are forcing, because the acreage for land that has to be used to grow corn, which, by the way, benefits guess who? Because 80% of all corn is genetically modified. So it benefits the agri-tyrants who are actually working for your active demise. We have my own home senator, Roy Blunt, who approved Monsanto's Protection Act that gives them complete and utter total immunity and impunity from not only the courts, but from Congress even being able to regulate the product that has been empirically proven to be dangerous to human health. Who is a congressman to submit a bill and get it passed because he's been bribed, that exempts a corporation from producing a product that exempts a corporation that produces a product that is dangerous to human life and gets an exemption for it from the courts and Congress itself? I hark you back to the first two segments. Ladies and gentlemen, that is treason. SF Gate has an article out about it too. They are pumping literally hundreds of millions of acres into cornfields. And they're doing it for what? Ethanol. Not for you to eat. For ethanol. Now, for the record, if you don't know, the math doesn't work on ethanol. Ethanol is a product that is added as an additive to gasoline. But it's far from green. First of all, when you break the soil up like that, it releases carbon dioxide into the system that's naturally locked into the soil. It creates erosion. And it requires farmers to now use all these new fertilizers and Roundups and all this other stuff that's deadly and toxic to us. And also all of these other industrial chemicals that are dangerous not only to human beings, but also the wildlife and the soil, permanently damaging it. Scientists are actually warning us that America's corn for ethanol policy would fail if too many farmers plowed over virgin land. It would fail, first of all, as an anti-global warming strategy. And secondly, because what most people don't know is that to create ethanol, you burn coal or natural gas to produce the product. And most people don't recognize that it takes 2 gallons of fuel to produce 1 gallon of ethanol. This is nothing more than a corporate giveaway. That's all it is. That's all it's ever been. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. The Republic is under exigent threat because, among other things, the Wall Street Journal and CNBC have just released the testimony from an ex-Federal Reserve official. I don't know if you've heard this or not. His name is Andrew Huszar. And the Wall Street Journal titles it, Confessions of a Quantitative Easer. Here's what he has to say. We went on a bond buying spree that was supposed to help Main Street, and instead it was a feast for Wall Street. This is his actual article. I can only say I'm sorry, America. That's the opening line, ladies and gentlemen. I can only say I'm sorry, America. As a former Federal Reserve official, I was responsible for executing the centerpiece program for the Fed's first plunge into the bond-buying experiment known as quantitative easing. The central bank continues to spin QE as a tool for helping Main Street. But I've come to recognize the program for what it really is. The greatest backdoor Wall Street bailout of all time. Did you just hear that? This is an insider. The guy who was actually responsible for the design, implementation, and execution of the program. His life isn't probably worth a plug nickel going forward. You know, he's a young fella by the look of him, and I'll wager he has a heart attack before 2016. 5 years ago this month, on Black Friday, the Fed launched an unprecedented shopping spree. By that point in the financial crisis, Congress had already passed legislation called the TARP, or the Troubled Asset Relief Program, to halt U.S. banking system's free fall. Beyond Wall Street, though, the economic pain was still soaring. In the last 3 months of 2008 alone, almost 2 million Americans lost their jobs. The Fed said it wanted to help through a new program of massive bond purchases. There were secondary goals, but Chairman Ben Bernanke made clear that the Fed's central motivation was to, quote, affect credit conditions for households and businesses, end quote. To drive down the cost of credit so that more Americans hurting from the tanking economy could use it to weather the downturn. In other words, to borrow money. For this reason, he originally called the initiative credit easing. My part of the story began a few months later, after having been at the Fed for 7 years. Until early 2008, I was working on Wall Street. In spring of 2009, when I got an unexpected phone call. Would I come back to work on the Fed's trading floor? The job? Managing what was the heart of the QE, quantitative easing, bond buying spree. A wild attempt to buy $1.25 trillion in mortgage bonds within a 12-month period. Incredibly, the Fed was calling to ask if I wanted to quarterback the largest economic stimulus in U.S. history. This was a dream job, but I hesitated. And it wasn't just nervousness about taking on such a responsibility. I had left the Fed out of frustration, having witnessed the institution deferring more and more to Wall Street. Independence is at the heart of any central bank's credibility, and I had come to believe that the Fed's independence was eroding senior Fed officials. That the Fed's independence was eroding, Senior Fed officials, though, were publicly acknowledging mistakes, and several of those officials emphasized to me how committed they were to a major Wall Street revamp. I could also see that they desperately needed reinforcements. I took a leap of faith. In its almost 100-year history, the Fed has never bought one mortgage bond. Not one. Now my program was buying so many each day through active, unscripted trading that we constantly risked driving bond prices to new highs and crashing global confidence in key financial markets. We worked feverishly to preserve the impression that the Fed knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't long before my old doubts resurfaced, because despite the Fed's rhetoric, my program wasn't helping to make credit any more accessible to the average American. The banks were only issuing fewer and fewer loans. More insidiously, whatever credit they were extending wasn't getting cheaper. QE may have been driving down the wholesale cost to banks to make the loans, but Wall Street was pocketing most of the extra cash. From the trenches, several other Fed managers also began voicing the concern that QE, quantitative easing, wasn't working as planned. And our warnings fell on deaf ears. In the past, Fed leaders, even if they ultimately erred, would have worried obsessively about the cost versus the benefit of any major initiative like this. Now the only obsession seemed to be with the newest survey of financial market expectations. or the latest in-person feedback from Wall Street's leading bankers and hedge fund managers. Sorry, U.S. taxpayer. Trading for the first round of QE ended on March 31st, 2010. The final results confirmed that while there had been only trivial relief from Main Street, the U.S. central bank's bond purchasing had been at an absolute coup for Wall Street. The banks didn't just benefit from the lower cost of making loans, they enjoyed huge capital gains on the rising value of the securities that they were holding, and fat commissions from brokering most of the Fed's QE transactions. Wall Street had experienced its most profitable year ever in 2009, and 2010 was starting off in much the same way. Pause in the story. 2009, ladies and gentlemen, was when most of America was watching their businesses evaporate and go up in smoke. One, because profitability was gone, and two, because they couldn't borrow the money to keep those business doors open. And literally tens of millions of Americans lost their jobs. Back to the story. You'd think the Fed would have finally stopped to question the wisdom of QE. But think again. Only a few months later, after a 14% drop in the U.S. stock market and renewed weakening in the banking sector, the Fed announced a new round of bond buying, QE2. Germany's finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, immediately called the decision, quote, clueless. That was when I realized the Fed had lost any remaining ability to think independently from Wall Street. Demoralized, I returned to the private sector. Where are we today? The Fed keeps buying roughly 85 billion bonds per month, chronically delaying so much as a minor QE taper. Over 5 years, its bond purchases have come to more than $4 trillion. Amazingly, in a supposedly free market nation, quantitative easing has become the largest financial market intervention by any government in world history. And the impact? Even by the Fed's sunniest calculations, aggressive QE purchasing over 5 years has generated only a few percentage points of U.S. growth. By contrast, experts outside the Fed, such as Mohammed El-Erian at PIMCO investment firm, suggest that the Fed may have created and spent over $4 trillion for a total return of as little as 0.25% of GDP. 0.25%. A mere 40 billion bump in U.S. economic output that cost us $4 trillion. Both of those estimates indicate that QE isn't really working. Unless you're Wall Street. Having racked up hundreds of billions of dollars in opaque Fed subsidies, U.S. banks have seen their collective stock prices triple since March of 29. The biggest ones have only become more of a cartel. Today, 0.2% of these banks now control more than 70% of all U.S. bank assets. 0.2% of these banks control more than 70% of all U.S. bank assets. That's not the 1%ers, folks. That's the 0.2%ers. That's 2 out of 1,000. Not 2 out of 100. As for the rest of America, good luck, because QE was relentlessly pumping money into the financial markets during the 5-year period. It killed the urgency for Washington to confront the real crisis, that of a structurally unsound U.S. economy. Yes, those financial markets have rallied spectacularly, breathing much-needed life back into the 401ks. But for how long? Experts like Larry Fink at BlackRock Investment Group are suggesting that conditions are again, quote, bubble-like. Meanwhile, the country remains overly dependent on Wall Street to drive their economic growth. Even when acknowledging QE's shortcomings, Chairman Bernanke argues that some action by the Fed is better than none at all, a position that his likely successor, Fed Vice Chairman Janet Yellen, also embraces. The implication is that the Fed is dutifully compensating for the rest of Washington's dysfunction. But the Fed is at the center of that dysfunction. Case in point, it has allowed quantitative easing to become Wall Street's new too big to fail policy. So now we have unscrupulous policies being forced down the throats of American businesses through ENDA, through the Obamacare mandates that are causing Americans to lose their jobs in the tens of millions or be subjected to going from a full-time employee to a part-time employee. We have an environmental tragedy occurring right underneath our very feet over ethanol. We have the wholesale theft of the nation's wealth through the quantitative easing and the secret hidden tax of inflation. And I haven't even begun to start hitting the list. We have a federal government, state governments, city governments, and agencies in the literally myriad thousands that are stealing your personal information, building dossiers and databases on you, spying on you, listening to your conversations, storing every piece and gathered piece of information they can get upon you. And as it turns out, there's a story out in this morning's news about how the personal data of 4,500 people was shared with multiple agencies in the United States government, including the CIA, the IRS, and many, many other agencies, including Border Patrol and a host of other agencies. You know why? Because these 4,904 people bought a book on how to pass a lie detector test. Really now. We're down to secretly investigating 4,904 people, the vast majority of whom don't even have any contact with the federal government in any way, shape, or form, because they bought a book about how to pass a lie detector test? 30 federal agencies were given these people's data, and it incorporated their names, their addresses, their social security numbers, their jobs, their professions, and they're under investigation for buying a book? Excuse me. Is this 1984? Perhaps Fahrenheit 451. Maybe it's Animal Farm. Maybe it's just the decline of the United States of America into abject, utter fascism. We have an EPA that is going out there and willfully destroying the energy industry in the United States of America for the fantasy unicorn farts of alternative energy like solar and wind, which, granted, can provide and produce some limited capabilities and some limited amount of our energy needs, but is nowhere near the ability to provide Americans' energy needs. And like a stupid, foolish, arrogant, spoiled, rotten child having a temper tantrum, this president has given executive orders to the EPA to utterly desolate oil, gas, coal, and the staple energy products of the United States of America, even when he doesn't have an alternative plan. He's like the rich kid who loses his job and says, I don't have another job and I don't really care. Who quits their job without another one in mind? Who operates without a plan? Ladies and gentlemen, what we have is a government that is operating like a child having a temper tantrum, a hissy fit. The IRS has become the weapon of mass destruction to be utilized as an enemy to the people themselves. The enforcer of a thugocracy run by a usurper who's not even an American citizen, has violated our laws, has fraudulently manufactured a birth certificate, which go and look at the evidence yourself. Don't take my word for it. I guarantee you that it was done with Photoshop because I watched how it was done. I saw the evidence. I saw the evidence that Congress was shown in a secret hearing. You've got a Congress who knows that the president is a usurper and not a U.S. citizen, not even qualified to sit in the seat of president, and yet they are part and parcel participating in the wholesale betrayal and sellout and treason and desolation of our nation. You have a nation that has lost its international standing based on a petulant child stomping around having temper tantrums about Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, breaking and destroying our allegiances and our bridges with Germany and Europe and the European nations, going down and insulting our allies and our friends. This man doesn't burn bridges. He is like a battleship driving through a small canal. And he has no concern for the wake that he leaves behind him that wreaks havoc. His intention is, damn the torpedoes and full steam ahead. I will implement my agenda for the destruction of America. And it's time we put a stop to it. And if Congress won't do it, then it's up to us. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it and to institute new government. When a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object of despotism evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right and their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Still, if you will not fight for the right, when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory is sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. There may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as a slave. Winston Churchill. Find us at americasvoicenow.org, facebook.com/americasvoicenow, youtube.com/americasvoicenow, spreaker.com/americasvoicenow, google.com/plus America's Voice Now. I'm throwing the challenge and the gauntlet down to every one of you. Will you stand up and fight for this country? Spread this message. Take this document. Take this. I don't care if you transcribe it, record it. I don't care how you get it out there. Get it out to America. It's danger close, folks. Danger close.